Congratulations.
That's
I should
awesome.
probably pause the recording. I can edit this out. Here. So, all right. So now we are recording. So just no foul language, anybody. Um, Welcome to the Goal One call of the year, the first one. And and I'm gonna leave it to Tiffany, Eric, and Hassan, who are on the call, to kick this off while I start driving. But I'm gonna mute myself and probably turn off my video, but I can hear you. All right.
So you're still listening.
Yes. All right. So go ahead and start. Thank you.
Let's see. Who wants to kick it off? I still have to open up the the agenda myself.
Well, I will help kick off the introduction, and a huge thank you, Cecilia, Eric, and Hassan, for being on this call that we rescheduled. I hope everyone had an amazing new year. We're 8 days into 2020. Hopefully your life has been peaceful and happy, which is a good segue into our question. So let's see what our intro question. What was your favorite holiday moment? And so my favorite holiday moment was when we took the kids to see the grandparents in Kansas, and my son rode a bike for the first time that Santa brought him. And so that was really exciting to see. You know, he just felt so proud and accomplished. And I was just amazed that we were able to, you know, successfully inform Santa of our relocation to Kansas for for the holiday. So with that, Hassan, what was your favorite holiday moment?
I got to spend about a week and a half off, so I got to spend time with family, with my wife and my son, and just pretty much disconnected from anything work-wise. So that to me was, I just really enjoyed that. I guess that leaves Eric.
I love your background, by the way. Let's see. I think a lot of nice moments. All of my family members were probably sick at various times, but one of the things that was a favorite, and it was sort of it was a New Year's Day night, so not New Year's Eve. We had a friends gathering, so not but basically we just had like we played board games, and it was just really good and warm to start off the year, you know, not just with family, but some of our friends from around the community, and playing games and talking. So that's a nice way to help start the year. So that was my favorite. I don't know that Cecilia can chime in, so well, we might give her a second, but if not, we can move on.
Okay, I'm going to just say my favorite holiday moment was that I got to spend the holidays with my son, who I haven't seen in 18 months. So he is traveling, I guess, all over the world right now, and he got his holiday work visa confirmed for New Zealand. So he will be in New Zealand for a while, but I got to spend the holidays with him, and we visited temples in Angkor Wat and went to Singapore and Vietnam. So there you go. Okay, I'm back on mute.
Let's see, and I'm sort of stumbling between 2 or 3 different screens. So the topic for today, I'm not sure if I have a totally great handle on it, but one of the things that we were talking about earlier and talking about in prep for the call, and sort of for folks who are joining us later, is how do we keep diversity, equity, inclusion top of mind when there are these variety of discussions that are happening in and around the ESHIP goals. And I know that's been something of a struggle, so I don't have anything prepared, but I think there's a few different sort of vectors on this. Oh, Tiffany has shared the question, and I'm so glad. How do we continue to champion DEI issues that arise, or addressing DEI issues that arise in the act of doing our work, and not unintentionally perpetuate the exclusionary systems that got us here in the first place? So yeah, this is sort of a big, to me, this is probably one of the biggest concerns or focus areas that I've got both in my community here in Albuquerque, New Mexico, but also in the work that I'm doing with Forward Cities. And the thing that I'd share is that each community has got its own issues in and around this. Just taking New Mexico as a starting point, you know, the segment of our population that's African American is pretty tiny by percentage. And there's a significant Hispanic population. Some of the folks from the Hispanic population have been in leadership roles and helping run the state of New Mexico from before it was a state for hundreds of years. However, there are also quite a few, more recent immigrants and even undocumented folks that are here as well. So that's a significant issue for us. And there's a lot of different trauma that's happened over the many years based on, different things, different policies of the U.S. government, things that have happened here locally. In addition to that, a significant part of our population in Albuquerque, but certainly throughout New Mexico, is a Native American population. And there's a lot of different terrible things that have happened over the many years with them as well. So as we're focused on, how do we make our entrepreneurial ecosystems more healthy, we've got a set of issues and histories and cultures to work with that are probably unique. And in some ways, I think probably every city's got that. So, whether that's Tulsa or St. Louis or Detroit, wherever you go, you're going to come into these different, you're going to have these different, histories that contribute to an inequitable entrepreneurial ecosystem. So the question that's our charge, not I think just for this session, but in the operation of this group throughout the year, is how do we help the ecosystem builders throughout our networks? How do we help them grapple with this? How do we help them deal with this in an effective way that doesn't, again, perpetuate some of the inequitable practices in the past? And that's, I guess that's our open question for our discussion today. So I don't know, I've been blathered on for a little bit, but just any immediate or thoughts or responses from Hassan or Tiffany?
For me, the thing that comes to mind, and you touched on it, Eric, is the history. I think sometimes people come to the conversation without the appreciation of the history that led to where we are at. And sometimes people make the assumption that, everybody is now sitting, figuratively around the table, that you can start fresh. And there are people that are at the table that have a lot of history that others may not be aware of, or others may not appreciate, a lot of history that they've. I think it's important to acknowledge what's happened in the past, and it's important to understand that as a starting point.
I think that's really true. And getting, how do we get people to the point where they feel safe and comfortable to share that history without feeling pressure or they're responsible to have to be the ones to share that history? And on the flip side, how do we encourage people to not be afraid to ask questions, but at the same time be curious themselves and not depend on other people to educate them? I think there's some level of responsibility that people should take going into situations or organizations or projects, knowing that there are different histories and different perspectives. And so what can we do to help communication flow freer, while still though being productive, in trying to cohesively work together to accomplish the goal that's set out in front?
So I'm going to chime in for a second. And I think when we're talking about history, I don't know if Eric is familiar with it. I believe it's in New Mexico somewhere, but I saw an interesting approach to preserving history, but at the same time moving forward. There's a statue or a monument for something about, I think it's something around a fight, a massacre, some atrocious event that happened where they were commemorating soldiers that fought Native Americans or something like that. And instead of taking down the statue, which is a lot of the go-to, or like, you know, how we rename districts and schools and streets and stuff like that. What they had actually done is they added another plaque to the monument that said, this is something that happened at a point in history where things like this were heralded. And since then, we've moved on and realized that what happened was not a good thing or whatever. And I'm going to try to find the example when I get back on my computer. But I thought it was a really interesting way to acknowledge what happened and show that there's a future and people have moved on. So the whole concept of whitewashing history is something that there's a lot of pushback for. So I'm really curious to hear from you how what are the best approaches that you've seen in people honoring history and at the same time moving forward.
Yeah, and so I think that's great. And that's actually the question that was on my mind is, you know, how do we deal with these histories? So I'll do a bad job of explaining, or providing a little more context on what Cecilia shared. I think there's sort of two things that came together, or two things that come to mind. So in the further past of New Mexico, so there was the sort of the Spanish conquest of this region. And then there was a revolt from Native American tribes. And then there was also a return of the Spanish conquistadors to sort of take back that land. So there's a couple of different cultural, you know, items in New Mexico that have gone on for, you know, hundreds of years. That was represented in one way is the, let's see, Doña, I'm forgetting his full name, but the statue of Oñate, who one of the things he was known for was basically he removed the feet of prisoners. But there was a statue sort of honoring him as part of the return. The event, or one of the events that I'm somewhat familiar with, is that the city of Santa Fe has celebrated this return for what, 300 or so years. And what happened, I want to say about 2 years ago, and this is a focus of some work that happened at, there's a race equity, race forward event that took place in Albuquerque last year that talked about how the historians and some artists and others from Santa Fe, some of the tribal governments came together to say, we need to recognize that that there is this history. So we acknowledge it. We don't just sort of move on and, you know, the statues are gone and all this, and we kind of put it out of mind. But instead, how do we recognize that this happened and find some way to encourage both conversation and you know, sort of a more thoughtful response to that. And some of this work around community building, sometimes, and strategic doing, sometimes that's restorative. It's considered restorative, meaning that we are reconnecting, or we're providing, you know, sort of benefit and access to groups that should have had access for a long time, but have not for whatever reason. And I think it was interesting to see here in New Mexico how both city, I want to say the state was involved to some extent, and community and artists came together to find a way to address and acknowledge, maybe do some of the healing work necessary so that we could have, you know, other conversations about, you know, what's happening now and what the future looks like. Because if you can't address the past, those wounds, those fissures and fractures, etc., those are always going to come back to us. again, I feel like I'm just blathering today, but that's some of what we saw here in New Mexico, and I think it was valuable. One other element that I'll toss in, that not quite the same thing, but I think is we've seen as being valuable, is with many of the Native American groups that are operating. One of the things they start whatever event with is they introduce themselves both in their own language, but they also give a little bit of a history of the place and the land. You know, who did this land belong to 400 years ago? You know, where are we currently operating? And honoring some of that history, I think, is useful in providing some deeper context, that this is not just a thing that's happening, you know, this is not just business of the past 10 years. This is something that's, you know, got hundreds of years background. We've got folks in the room who've, you know, been on one side or another side of a conflict. But by providing that additional context, I think it helps ground the conversation in a more meaningful way.
Eric, when would they mention that? Would it be like can you help me picture the context of when that would be discussed?
So as part of, say, the welcome, or part of the initial part of a gathering, say it's a conference or some other kind of maybe more official meeting, typically, at least those the events, and I don't want to, I'm sure I'm not doing full justice to it myself, but as part of that initial, you know, we're coming together for a reason, but we're also coming together on land that that was or still is owned by this group. It's letting us know that, in a way, you know, whoever's currently, you know, owning or controlling it, that's in some ways that's temporary. And I think, again, I think that helps provide a useful context. And you're not just thinking about what the here and now, but you're thinking about sort of both the deeper past, and that helps us, I think about, you know, a longer term future. I don't know if that helps or answers your question.
No, it definitely does. Thank you. Thinking of ecosystem building and entrepreneurial support, how could you, because I think that's fantastic. And so how would that be translated, or what do you think that would look like as far as helping entrepreneurs grow, thrive, be successful?
I'll throw out two sort of top of head examples. So one, there are a variety of communities across the country that have had different race riots, whatever. And I'm thinking of, say, the big Tulsa riot, you know, 100 years ago. And in some ways that seems like a long time ago, and in some ways only 100 years since, you know, 100 people sort of lost their lives, you know. And so putting things in context with that kind of history, I think is useful. And that's really, in some ways, to what extent are we, say, addressing these kinds of traumas, et cetera, and how does that help inform the work that we're doing currently? So there's that piece. A different thing that I'll say that's maybe less focused on that, and I mentioned in the notes, you know, I think my starting point is sort of race and sort of cultural history, and that's not the only thing we're talking about here. So I do want to acknowledge that. But I think Kansas City does a great job of telling the story of Kansas City, and, you know, how, when this sort of westward expansion, when this started, you know, what's the entrepreneurial nature of that, and how did that come together? And when we think about, you know, trade routes, and we think about technology and innovation that may have happened over 100 years ago, I think sometimes that also is helpful to say, you know, we may not be one of the top 2 or 3 tech hubs in the country, but we're doing, you know, really, really important things, and we've been doing those for a long, long time. So I think it's not just about the past injustice, it's also past, you know, things that we can be proud of. And these people did this amazing thing. So I think grounding ourselves in a little bit of history also helps us when we think about what makes our place special. What makes, you know, why should we be in Detroit or or wherever? So I do think that the history and a little bit of that storytelling around that is helpful, but that's I'll get off my soapbox.
No, no, I totally agree with you, Eric. So we had back in 1967 in Detroit, we had some serious race riots. And if you think about it, 1967 isn't that long ago. So you had folks who were kids who were around at that time. You have adults that were living that are still alive today. So that is in the back of a lot of people's minds because they actually lived it. And there were physical reminders of it every day in the city because there are areas of the city that never recovered that were still like probably up until a few years ago when the whole revitalization started happening in Detroit. There were areas of the city that were still burned out from 1967, like completely vacant commercial corridors and burned out buildings that were just never rehabbed. So there's the physical reminder, and then there was the fact that people lived it. And on the anniversary of that, a couple years back in 2017, there was a big storytelling campaign around those riots, and there was a film. So I think acknowledging it, the fact that people acknowledged what happened and were talking about it, and really helped. And there was an organization that was kind of came out of that in I think right around 1970 called New Detroit, and the purpose of that was basically to provide multicultural leadership training. So they have this series called New Detroit's Multicultural Leadership Training, and it's a cohort that they put together of folks from across the city and the surrounding areas. I think it's maybe one cohort a year, but every month, the cohort visits an organization. So there's 1 month where you're at an Arab American organization, 1 month you are at the African American Charles Wright Museum of African American History there. So just about every group that's represented in Detroit in terms of ethnic groups is part of the cohort, and the cohort visits with those groups once a month to learn about the history. So you'd spend a full day at an organization to learn about the history of that group, what they're currently doing. I mean, there are things I've lived in the city for most of my life, and there were things that I just was not, and I felt that I was pretty knowledgeable about the city and the different people that are in the city. And until I went through that cohort, there were things that I just did not know about groups that I'm interacting with every single day. So that was very helpful. So it basically takes leaders, and a lot of them were nonprofit leaders from the city that end up eventually working with each other or were working with each other and didn't know much about the history of the groups that they're with. So things like that have been helpful.
So I think that's, hang on, I'm not driving anymore. So I think that's really helpful. In making sure that we set the tone, I think is really important, right? It's these are great examples of how we bring people in to the space and the community with intent to know that that something has happened. Eric mentioned the 1921 race massacre. We're coming up on the 100-year anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre. And for a while, it used to be called the Tulsa Race Riots. And riot just really meant that insurance companies didn't have to pay because they said it was a race riot, and not that people were massacred. And so building businesses in that area that was known as Black Wall Street is really a sense of pride and importance, and it's something that needs to be focused on, and that's what Tulsa as a city is doing, and the foundations are working around that. So so acknowledging that, but knowing that history wasn't taught in Tulsa public schools until my son was in school. Hold on. Now I'm going to echo. I'm going to try to cancel this out. Okay, sorry.
Hi, my name is Stephanie, and I will be taking over for Tulsa today.
Okay, so
How
weird. I'm gonna try to What? How weird. I have no idea what's going on. Okay. That was the weirdest thing. All right. I have no idea. Anyway, I'm gonna walk around my condo now. So now that we've set the tone, what are the systems that we see in the way that we bring people into entrepreneurship or ecosystem building or any of that that seems to be problematic? Like, what are things that you've noticed where we could improve on how we welcome people in or how we introduce people to the space?
Cecilia always brings the easy questions. I love it. It's, you know, I mean, there's a variety of sort of channels that are somewhat common among the cities. I think 1 million cups is a thing. Many cities have kind of a, like Austin 101 or Kansas City, I think, has something akin to that, where folks will kind of give an intro to what's going on in the city. So I'm not sure how to directly answer your question, but the thing that I'll say, or the thing that's sort of on my mind related to that is, I think it's useful. I don't know, this might be a side or not, so but I'll ramble on for another 2 minutes, hopefully, which is that one of the things I was thinking initially was that really everyone who's being an ecosystem builder needs to have this cultural competency. And that should be like a training thing that we do with Women Cups folks and other folks, etc. And something that I've heard, or I think learned more recently, is, if that's a lot to actually ask or demand of folks, but if we can establish a better sense of like what Shayla with Forward Cities is calls more of a cultural humility, and recognizing that even if we're strong in this or that area, we're strong on race or ethnicity or gender, there's different aspects that we're missing. And being aware that we as organizers don't always have the right answers, and that we should oftentimes listen a lot more than we talk to hear from folks, I think it is it's a better, healthier starting point versus thinking, I know how to solve this. No, I don't. I'm quite clear that I do not know how to solve a lot of these things, but hopefully I've learned enough to help identify some of the people who would be better at helping solve it. So I think there's that cultural humility piece, I think, that would be useful for most of us in this role to have. Similarly, I think, and this isn't something that could be standardized across the country, but I do think that having some sense of the history of a city, community, region is a good thing. So, when I think about this and have a moment, I think the folks who do the 1 Million Cups, or where we've got City Alive here and a few other organizations, if we all spent a little bit of time and got a little sense of, here's what was happening a couple hundred years ago, here's what's happened over the past 100 or so years, I think having a better sense of that, so that we have a common narrative that we can think about and refer to, I think that can lead to healthier connections between the different folks in community versus stumbling across things that we missed or are just not knowledgeable about. So, not answering your question, but that's where my head goes in response.
So Tiffany, think about your convening when you were at Rockefeller, and when people came into the room, what did you notice? What did you see? What was the sense that you got from, can we do this better as people came? Was it, how do you welcome people to integrate a little bit better, or to not clump, and to be more open to things?
So, even as Eric was talking, I'm thinking of the communities that were part of the Rockefeller program. I'm thinking about the rural communities that I serve, and I'm thinking about what would that look like if someone stood up and talked about the truth of the history of these communities. To be frank and honest, I think there's a ton of fragility happening and people would get very angry. I think that they wouldn't go to an event or a program if they knew that there was even going to be a discussion about the history. They would either think that they don't need to hear it because they know it all, going back, exactly to what Eric just said about the need for, cultural humility. And so, I mean, that was one of the biggest challenges that I faced and that I currently face is how do we communicate the benefit, and not even the economic benefit of having an inclusive field and what that looks like to empower and encourage entrepreneurs of, underserved, under-resourced groups, but to talk about even, as a community and as a person, how can learning the truth about our own history, whether we like it or not, help us to develop as more just compassionate people, humans. And so what was it? I don't know if that even answered the question exactly. What was the question? What did I notice when people walked into the room?
So what could we do? The tendency is to flock, right? And people flock to people like them.
Yeah.
People clump together. It's what you're comfortable with. It's that sense of belonging. So in trying to create a sense of belonging, when people start entering the room, whether it's 1 million cups or a conference or a convening, and you're right, what you were saying about talking about the history, as important as all of us feel about that, it's still a very fragile subject. And the thing is, you have to build the trust before you can delve into those conversations. Without building the trust, you can't have those be productive. So I think trying to, and in going back to the original question of how do we just not go back to the systems that that we've all experienced, and trying to create a new system where we can bridge, we can welcome, we can bring people together in a way that builds the trust. So I know that some 1 million cups communities have greeters, so maybe it seems like the greeter at Walmart, but when people come into the room, they shake their hand or they welcome them and they make them feel like they belong there and they're welcome. I think that works for a lot of communities, where it's not like you're the only person in the room who doesn't know anybody else, right? So I think about the convening that we were at when you were at Rockefeller, and how the towns sat in their tables. And it was really interesting to me, because there was some team dynamics, like a little competitiveness, which is healthy. But at the same time, I wonder, just in hindsight, to think about what it might have been had we taken like all the government people of all of those cities and put them all in one table, like mixed and matched that dynamic. So I wonder, when we convene people or when we start talking about things with people, that we change up the groups that they're in. Maybe it's everybody whose birthday ends in a month that has a Y, go sit over here, right? And the ones that have an R, go sit over there. And that's a whole different mix and match thing, where it's not flocking, right? Or they're flocking over a different thing. So we've changed up their initial connection to people. Does that make sense? So go ahead.
Well, that makes sense to me. I would even want to take a step back and say, how do we ensure that the people that are even attending the event, you know, even thinking of the Rockefeller group, the people that signed up to be a part of the program, you know, how do we ensure that the people that are flocking to an event aren't one and the same? And, you know, that's an issue that I see here with the programs that we do. If we don't call it, and you know, if it's just pitch night, I mean, the bulk of the people in the room are white. If it's minority pitch night, the bulk of the people are African American, and the venue will be the same. The day, you know, it's all on Facebook like this. It's so how, I don't know, and that, how can we integrate better?
Hassan, you work around a myriad of different communities. So let's ask you, how do you do that better?
So I'll say, I think part of the challenge, and I think that this isn't answering your question, but it's something I was thinking about when Eric and Tiffany were speaking, especially events that are convened by government. And I mean, this is my experience and what I've seen where I'm at, in events that are convened by philanthropy. Although they may be diverse, the group that attends the events or the groups are already people who are connected to the conversation. I mean, you'll have Arab Americans, you'll have immigrants from different groups, African American folks. But the folks that end up getting convened are folks that are already, to some extent, already connected, and you're missing out. And there's the assumption that the folks that are convened are representative of everybody else that's out there, when in fact they're not. There are people that are already in the know and already connected. We're still missing a whole vast group of people that are not connected. And I know it's
so
not
how do we engage those people?
I think so. I've seen some things that have worked is actually going directly into some of the neighborhoods, into some of the faith-based organizations, meeting with block clubs. I mean, on a really, really like at the neighborhood level on a much smaller scale. And it ends up, what's interesting is what I witnessed is that folks from philanthropy, when they find out about these meetings or convenings in the neighborhood, end up getting people that you otherwise would never have expected to see at these events, because they know that there's something happening on the ground in the neighborhood and a convening happening. So you get people that end up showing up that you otherwise would never have expected to be at the events. So it's kind of, instead of actually like the whole top-down thing, you're like right on the ground at the neighborhood level, and the people that are at the top are actually coming to the neighborhood, to these like really small convenings that are not as organized as they would have been if they were done from the top down, but they are the ones that are of value.
I think that's the key, right? Creating the value statement. Go ahead, Tiffany.
Hassan, can you paint me a bigger picture on what that looks like? Like, are these events that someone from a foundation is then going to as an attendee and participating in the conversation, or is this like the foundation person is going to this meeting and then recruiting from that, you know, saying, hey, we have this program happening, I'm inviting you to come here? Can you help me understand what that looks like?
So I'll give you an example of how some of this actually happens. So the City of Detroit's planning department put together all these framework strategies for different neighborhoods in Detroit. So neighborhoods outside of the core, downtown, the financial district, Midtown, these are like out in the neighborhood. So all this activity had happened downtown and none of it was touching the neighborhoods. So over the last maybe year and a half, the city has started to put together these like neighborhood framework strategies. And the conversation around it was that there would be all of these activities that could potentially get funded for some of the commercial corridors in these neighborhoods. So that was top down. We ended up having these convenings that happened in the neighborhoods. But what came out of those convenings that were convened by the city planning department is folks from block clubs, from churches, just residents from the neighborhood started to attend. And separate from that convening that the city planning department put together, they started to put together their own little meetings and convenings on their own. And the folks that were at the larger convening, when they would hear about these smaller convenings, would start to attend those smaller convenings that were convened by, block clubs and resident groups. So what started off as like top down ended up like at the neighborhood level, and the folks that had organized the larger convening then started to attend all of the smaller convenings that were happening separate from that large convening. Does that help?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
I just love hearing that. So I'll say we've both with some Forward Cities discussions, but also elsewhere in community here, talked about those similar kinds of things. And the one note that I'll mention is, as far as our thinking was, there are some groups that, even if they're not necessarily all that top down, if we know that, a significant chunk of the people sitting around the room are going to be people in, whether they're elected or they're part of an administration or they're part of a foundation that's providing funding, et cetera, those entities have a certain amount of power. And I think sometimes if you're a neighborhood entrepreneur, if you're just sort of just starting out, it's like, that feels like, obstacle isn't necessarily the right word, but it's like, that's not necessarily going to be a comfortable environment for me to go talk about, there's like it may seem in some ways like a small issue, but it's super, super important to me. So those kinds of things kind of need to happen in a more, I don't know, maybe kinder, gentler, more neighborhood kind of environment. The desire, and what I've been talking with a few folks about, is we want to get different representation from a lot of these different groups. But if we make that part of, say, our roadmap, and we say, what we want to group work with whatever entity is helping organize this is what it looks like today. But we recognize that we want this to be, more representative and otherwise reflect the makeup of our community. We may not be able to get, an A solution today. But if we get, a pretty good solution, and we're all on the same sheet of music about, we want to move in a direction that does reflect more of the different kinds of folks throughout our community, that feels like we can start build that bridge. So that helps us build a bridge from maybe more of the top down, but also while that's happening, helping, either identifying or making sure, or helping work with the different groups that are happening more at the neighborhood level to grow those and make those more active, sometimes just showing up. Because I do see in those, if someone, like one person shows up from this other organization and it's much more of like a neighborhood or faith-based kind of event or activity, having that one or two people is like, oh great, this is cool that, we had this one or two people come in. But if it was all those folks, it would be a very, very different environment. So that's what I'm reflecting. I'm so glad to hear about that in Detroit, Hassan.
One of, I think, another thing that I noticed out of some of those meetings and convenings is that I think for some folks, just being part of a larger convening and seeing a structure just gave them the confidence to do things on their own, because another thing too, and I guess this goes back to building trust and getting people engaged. Every one of those meetings and convenings had like a very tight agenda, but a lot of times people showed up at those meetings and like neighborhood residents and wanted to talk about why the garbage wasn't getting picked up, even though that had nothing to do with. And I think leaving the space for people to be open and be able to discuss those things, because they've never had an outlet outside of those convenings. And I've noticed in the past other meetings where when somebody starts talking about something that's not on the agenda, it gets shut down pretty quickly, and then people move on to something else. And there's like, in my view, there's nothing that will like kill trust more than doing that, because if people are like taking the time to show up and open up about what's on their minds when they probably haven't had any other outlet, like you got to give them the space to do that.
I think that's the space and the grace that's really important for people who are facilitating and convening. I think you're so spot on, Hassan, about creating that for people, because if you hear, well, that's not the agenda, and then you're like, well, who writes the agenda? It's like you wanna take Peter Block's community book, and I mean, I just want to make a big bat out of it and just whack people upside the head. But I know you're not supposed to do that. But I know that's integral and important, right? To think about. I was talking to a person that works for the city, and I said, the best thing you can do is to execute the will of the people. That's what you're there for. And they're like, well, we're responsible for this, you're responsible for that. I'm like, no, we actually put you there to execute the will of the people. So if you don't hear what the people want, then how are you supposed to execute, right? So it's a really interesting space. But I really appreciate, and I think you're right when you said being part of a bigger convening gives you the vision and the ability to see what's possible. And so Christine and I talk about modeling what's needed to create what's possible. If you don't show people that it's possible, then they don't know, because you only know what you know. So I think that's fair. But thank you so much for that. So we're coming up on we've got about 9 minutes, and I want to make sure that that we leave space to think about how we want to go forward. So I'm waiting to hear back from Lauren and Andy about some of the things that we discussed. I think Eric had mentioned on another call the idea about working towards a sprint for the next couple of months to work on ideas and projects and things like that that would be presentable at the next ESHIP Summit. I want the three of you to really think about, we've had some discussion about the agenda notes and things and how that becomes challenging, but we need to capture some of these things. So what I would love for you to do is, if you could, in the notes agenda for goal 1 for this call, write down your top 3 takeaways, right? And a call to action item. So think about the things that we discussed and what for you were some key takeaways. Write down 1 or 2. Between the 4 of us, we'll come up with something. And then maybe an action item or a call to action that we can think about as people who think about being inclusive. Does that make sense? So what we would like to share with the community, as far as, here is something to think about as you go forward. Okay? And maybe what we'll do is we'll curate some of our agenda notes, because what we're trying to do is curate, cultivate things that can be shared in the next playbook. So we want to keep agenda notes so that we know that what we've talked about on this call doesn't get lost in space, and that we're moving the field forward. So here are the things that we want to make sure. We're moving the field forward. We're expanding some knowledge and some trust, and how we're building community and how we're building a field. So if we can focus on those things, I think then we're doing a great job. Okay. So last couple of minutes, what is your one word for 2020? What are you going into 2020 thinking about? And I will start with Eric because he's heard this question before. Wait, unmute.
Oh, I refuse. You know, some people say, what do you think I said? Since I was muted. No, there's a lot of work, but I'm going to put a positive spin on it. So it's work, exclamation point. I will hand off to Tiffany.
My word is courage. Hassan?
So I'm going to use the same word I used the other day so I can be consistent. Transformation.
Information. Great. Okay. And I'm just excited, but that's not my word. I feel like I want to approach this work advocating. So I'm gonna work on advocating for people, advocating for myself, advocating for the community. It's advocating for the work that we do. That's what I'm gonna work on this year, is to be a better advocate. So I appreciate everyone's time. I'm going to give you back 5 minutes of your day. Thank you so much, and we'll definitely be in touch. So thank you. And if you'll put your key takeaways and a call to action item on the agenda notes, that would be great. Right? Have a great week.
Awesome. Thanks to you all. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.